Great. So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for attending this evening. First, I want to say thank you very much for Photo London for hosting this talk. And thank you again all for joining. I'm going to briefly introduce myself, and then I will pass it on to our speaker this evening. So my name is Lisa. I'm a writer and editor at the Burlington Magazine. We are the longest standing art history journal in the English language. We published our first issue in 1903. And in addition to the print issue, the monthly print issue, we also have a free online journal for contemporary art. And that is going to be launching its 7th issue at the end of June, and that will be on the topic of drawing. And we are very excited that we could partake as part of the program of Photo London, because in May we will be publishing our 2nd issue dedicated to photography. And the first was published in December 2021. And our speaker tonight has contributed a fascinating article, which will be the topic of tonight's talk. So I'm going to do a brief introduction. So Ella Ravilious is Curator of Architecture and Design at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. And she is a PhD student at the Photographic History Research Centre at De Montfort University in Leicester. The article, which she will tell you more about, discusses the first attempts at photographing the Bayeux Tapestry in the 1870s. And she has also recently published a book, which she co-edited with Elizabeth Edwards, who is Professor Emerita of Photographic History at De Montfort University, about the role of photographs in museums, and it is called What Photographs Do. And that book can also be downloaded for free on the UCL Press website. So yeah, so that's it really. So I'd like to let Ella speak now.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can see them.
Terrific, thank you.
Oh, sorry, just before you start, I forgot to mention, anybody who has questions for Ella, you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to send them. You can all access the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and you can send questions throughout. And once Ella has finished her talk, we will try to answer as many of them as we can.
Great, thank you. So, where this story begins is actually with photography not of the Bayeux Tapestry, but of another canonical artwork. I and a colleague had become very interested in the historic glass plate negative collection held by what is now the V&A, but until 1899 was called the South Kensington Museum. Specifically, we'd gotten really excited about the archive of negatives created or owned by the V&A's own photographic studio, which was formally instituted in 1856, so very early. Among the many incredible negatives we looked at, we came across some which were for glass plate negatives of unusually large sizes. So among this collection were these colossal glass plate negatives, which are 3 foot square. And I'm including my preamble about these as they set up my themes of tonight about negatives, about what we can learn from negatives, and also about the 19th century museum's level of ambition and technical wizardry for photographic reproductions of artworks. So the art historians among you might have recognized what this negative depicts. It shows one of the Raphael cartoons, one of 7 huge full-scale designs for the tapestries created by Raphael in around 1513 for the Sistine Chapel. 7 of these cartoons belong to the royal family, but have been on loan to the V&A since 1865. However, if you look at this negative, you can see that the cartoon is actually outside in front of a building. You can see that there's grass in the foreground of the negative. So what you're actually looking at here is a negative taken in 1858 at Hampton Court, the former home of the Tapestries before they were loaned to the V&A. The negative was made by Charles Thurston Thompson, the museum's first official photographer, with permission from the Queen. In order to get a decent photograph with the technologies of the day, the cartoons had to be taken outdoors. So the team of Royal Engineers, led by one Captain Folk, who were assisting this project, came up with a way of lowering each tapestry out of a window at Hampton Court so that they could be photographed by Thompson, using a giant camera specially designed by Folk for the purpose. And you've got to remember, if you've got 3-foot square negatives, then you need a 3-foot square and then some camera body to take them. So this was a really major operation. Among other uses, the photographs made from negatives from this project were used in 1864 as what conservators call a condition report, a detailed assessment of the physical condition of a museum object. Here you can see Richard Redgrave, the first keeper of paintings at the South Kensington Museum, marking existing damage to the cartoons in pen onto one of Thurston Thompson's photographs, immediately prior to the move of the tapestries from Hampton Court to the museum. And this set of annotated photographs has been referred back to in conservation of the cartoons ever since. And what this project and the photographs I'm about to introduce to you revealed to me is how deeply invested the museum was in photography at this early stage, and how ingenious they were, both in the logistics for and the uses of photography. To me, these projects and others I could talk about from the 19th century museum remind me of contemporary digital replicas of art and heritage, such as Factomate's reproduction of Tutankhamun's tomb in 2014, or the work of Scan the World or Google Arts and Culture. And I came to realise that this ambition to replicate works of art using the most cutting-edge technologies was itself nothing new. So with that frame in mind, let's talk now about how in September of 1872, a young British photographer named Edward Dossiter was stood face to face with the famous embroidery known as the Bayeux Tapestry, which was then displayed in the Galerie Mathilde in Bayeux. Dossiter had been sent from London to photograph the tapestry in its entirety for the South Kensington Museum. And this was the first time that the tapestry had been photographed. But the difficulties Dossiter were presented with were considerable. At the time of Dossiter's visit, the tapestry, arguably the most important textile to survive from the early medieval period, had been an object of research and hypothesis for over a century. There were, by 1872, several sources of visual information about the tapestry. It had first been brought to widespread attention by the Benedictine scholar Bernard de Montfaucon, who published a 2-volume set about them. The first volume, published in 1729, was illustrated with engravings of part of the tapestry after a drawing made by Nicolas Joseph Foucault, made in about 1695. And the second volume, which came out the following year, contained engravings based on drawings by Antoine Benoit. Between 1816 and 1818, the antiquarian draftsman Charles Stothard made detailed drawings of the complete tapestry for the Society of Antiquaries of London. And those were published as hand-coloured engravings, as you can see here, by James Bashir from 1821. But the first full-size copy was drawn in ink and watercolour by young boy students of the Percy Street Academy for Boys in Newcastle in 1851 to 52, under the direction of the antiquary John Collingwood Bruce. Regarding this copy, Professor of Art History Shirley Ann Brown has described how its pedagogical value was immediately recognised, and it became the first full-size replica to travel around England, spreading knowledge of the tapestry to a new and general audience. However, all of these copies were all flawed in different ways as accurate records. Some were heavily stylised, and Stothard, for example, had filled in gaps in the tapestry with his own interpretations of what might be missing. According to Michael Lewis at the British Museum and David Musgrove of BBC History magazine, This was with the intention of restoring the tapestry in his drawings to the condition that he believed it was in when it was first documented by researchers almost a century previously. He did this by joining the dots in the form of needle holes that he could see on the original tapestry, and perhaps also reinventing some images. By 1872, the need for photography of the tapestry had been recognised for some time. In 1857, Charles Kinnear, one of the founding members of the Photographic Society of Scotland, had written in the Journal of the Photographic Society to strongly recommend that the next photographer finding themselves in Normandy should attempt the task. Not least because of the technical challenge of photographing the nearly 70-metre long embroidery, the first attempts to create a photographic record of the tapestry were based on drawn or painted copies of it. In 1860, Joseph Albert, the official photographer to the Royal Court of Bavaria, made salted paper prints of various copies of the tapestry, including that undertaken by Collingwood Bruce, and also sets of drawings made by artist Victor Sansonetti in the 1830s. These salted paper prints were used to illustrate an English translation published that year of Wace's Roman de Rue, a verse chronicle of the Dukes of Normandy, written in 1150. But as you can see here, the prints are mostly quite small. So whereas other photographic records, such as this one, were copies of the tapestry, Dossiter's task was to produce a complete, full-scale photographic record from the original. The result of considerable investment by the museum in replicating the tapestry through photographic means, the photographs taken by Dossiter were intended to aid scholarship on the tapestry and promote understanding of it in Britain. Now, photographing the tapestry was an important goal for the South Kensington Museum and for its first director, Henry Cole, in particular. As a result of his experience managing the Great Exhibition of 1851, Cole believed passionately in the power of gathering good examples of the world's art and design at the museum to educate British designers and artists. The museum collected originals where it was possible, but in no way scorned replicas, reproductions, and facsimiles. Indeed, Cole believed they had vital roles to play. He used reproductions as objects to disseminate art and design through loans by the museum's circulation department, and also to expand the collection beyond what could be feasibly collected in the original. He used copies of art made by the museum extensively as tools of cultural exchange and diplomacy. Consequently, he was fluent in the reproductive technologies of his day, such as plaster casting and electrotypes, as well as photography. And he drove forward efforts to replicate examples of the world's greatest art and design. Cole believed that a copy of the tapestry in the museum would generate public interest and also position the museum as an institution supporting both creative skills and art historical research. The tapestry was also in Cole's sights because of the museum's burgeoning interest in historical textiles. The museum collected textiles from its earliest days, seen as suitable for an institution focused on design and the decorative arts. Interested in embroidery, however, was gathering pace during the 1860s and 1870s. The museum had acquired an important collection of woven and embroidered fabrics from the German art collector and dealer Franz Bock in 1860, and had also bought the early 14th century Syon cope in 1864, described then as the finest surviving example of English ecclesiastical embroidery. The School of Needlework, now the Royal School of Needlework, founded in 1872, the year the tapestry was photographed, helped spur the beginnings of a revival of hand stitching associated with William and May Morris and the arts and crafts movement. And the museum responded to this interest by arranging the special loan exhibition of decorative art needlework made before 1800 in 1873, the year that Dossiter's photograph of the tapestry was first displayed. In 1864, John Charles Robinson, the museum's first curator, discovered that a fragment of the tapestry was to be sold at auction, and it was bought for the museum. This fragment had passed through several hands, but had formerly been owned by Charles Stoddard. There was controversy about how it had come to be in his possession, and for many years his wife Eliza was unfairly blamed for its removal. In fact, it had been taken by Stoddard himself during his visits in 1816 to draw the tapestry. The South Kensington Museum's initial request to photograph the tapestry in 1871 had been refused by the Bayeux authorities on conservation grounds. In August 1872, Cole offered to repatriate the fragment, hoping to encourage a change of mind. His ploy worked. Cole and the printer and publisher and photographer Joseph Cundall, who since 1866 had been in charge of the museum's publications and reproductions, sent Dossiter to Normandy the following month. Dossiter was tasked with taking life-size photographs of the whole tapestry. The problem confronting him, however, was that it was displayed in a small room lit unevenly by windows at the side and one end. The tapestry was installed in a glazed cabinet in which the glass panes were divided by brass joints. The custodians allowed the glass panes to be removed for photography, but would not permit the tapestry to be taken out. Since the negatives would be contact printed by sunlight, they would need to be the same size as the desired prints. In this small chamber, Dossiter just couldn't get his camera and tripod far enough away from the embroidery to make full-size negatives. And he also had the problem of the brass joints, which obscured a complete view of it within the cabinet. Dossiter therefore took negatives at half the size of the tapestry, for Cundall to enlarge and print in London. For an extra cost of £60, Cundall made larger glass internegatives in order to be able to create prints of the desired size. Frank Reed Folk described the process a few years afterwards as follows. Owing to the difficulties of manipulating a large camera in the relatively small space of the chamber at Bayeux, the negatives first taken were but half the size of the original. From these, transparencies were made, from which enlarged negatives were taken, and from these also the reduced negatives for Fak's book were also produced. The original negatives are 12 inches square, and the internegatives measure 26 by 23 inches, allowing full-scale prints of the tapestry, which itself is about 20 inches high. 170 of Dossiter's original negatives and 175 internegatives survive in the V&A's archive. The internegatives weigh about 2.2 kilograms each. And I'm particularly interested by these examples. So there's two like this. I'm showing you one at the moment, which show a narrow strip of the tapestry curved round the edge of a mount and cropped for printing. This shows both the way the tapestry was displayed in the 1870s, but also conveys the dedication of Dossiter and Cundall in capturing every possible bit of the tapestry through photography. A glimpse into how the two sets of negatives were viewed appears in an 1893 letter to the museum from Cundall's son, who wrote that the original negatives have an especial value as they are the only means by which a full-size negative which has been damaged can be replaced by making an enlargement from them. The full-size negatives being more liable to damage on account of their weight and size and the unequal expansion caused by the sun when exposed in the printing frames. The issues of uneven lighting and brass joints were resolved by Dossiter's careful angling of each shot and by cropping the resulting prints when they were assembled. And it's only by examining the original negatives that we can see the edges showing the joints and the glimpses of the room, which were cropped off when the prints were made. And this is part of the joy of negatives for me. Unlike prints, which may have been cropped and have likely faded, glass plate negatives are still pin sharp and have this immediacy that puts you suddenly back in the room with the photographer. This preservation of detail also makes them valuable as conservation records, as they are sharp enough to see each stitch. Despite the challenges Dossiter faced, the 170 photographs were successfully printed at life size and assembled, creating a 213-foot photographic representation of the entire tapestry. The total cost of the project was £1,300, roughly equivalent to £81,000 today, which really shows the seriousness of the museum's investment in making photographic copies of works of art. Wanting their copy to be as true to the original as possible, the museum sent a prize-winning student from the National Art Training School, Thomas Walter Wilson, to Normandy to hand paint the photographs while he was able to refer directly to the tapestry itself. The school, which was renamed the Royal College of Art in 1896, was administrated by the same government body as the museum, the Department of Science and Art, and was also based within the museum's estate at this time, with the students getting involved in many projects like this. Further copies of the photographs were then painted on the basis of Wilson's version by other students at the school. Previously thought to be Woodbury types, a type of photomechanical reproduction of a photograph patented by Walter Bentley Woodbury in 1864, the prints are in all probability albertypes, a colour-type printing process invented in 1868 by Joseph Albert, the photographer who had made those salted paper prints for Wace's book. In 1871, Cundall wrote to Henry Cole about the arrangements for the project, stating that advantage will be taken of one of the new mechanical and absolutely permanent processes of photography, probably that of the albertype, which is particularly adapted to the reproduction of such works as the tapestry. As well as permanency, colour-type processes produced a photographic surface that was more absorbent than an album in print, and so was more suitable for being painted. And adding colour by hand secured an even more lifelike reproduction. Though one aspect undermined this accuracy, in that contemporary morals meant that one modification was undertaken to obscure a marginal figure's genitalia, as you can see in the slide here. 6 hand-coloured copies of the full-sized photographs of the entire tapestry were made, for a final cost to the department of £216 each. These were published through the Arundel Society, an organisation dedicated to publishing and promoting knowledge of works of art. And they were offered for sale on a roll, in a portfolio, or in a bound volume at the cost of £50 a copy uncoloured and £75 coloured. 2 were acquired by the South Kensington Museum, of which one is divided into 25 separate sections of 8 feet each, and the other takes the form of a 65-metre roll. 1 full-size and 1 half-size version were presented to Bayeux. The full-size copy at Bayeux was unfortunately destroyed in the early 20th century, having been damaged. But the whereabouts of the other 3 copies are unknown, although this one appeared on the art market in 2009. Now, these coloured photographs represented the cutting edge of reproductive technology in the 1870s. But 150 years of wear and chemical changes to both the tapestry and its replicas make it hard to establish how accurate the colouring was. But the historian Ella Burton, who lectured on the tapestry at the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art in 1877, described the photographic copies as an exact representation of the tapestry at Bayeux, only the colours were not so bright. So I think we can think that they're pretty good. These painted photographs inhabited a shifting space between photography, painting, and reproduction. Between the 1860s and the 1930s, the museum invested significantly in commissioning hand-painted photographs of art objects. But they inhabited this liminal status between specialisms, and their perceived usefulness to the museum was overtaken by advances in colour photography and photographically illustrated publishing. Many such painted photographs of artworks that we used to have were disposed of by the museum throughout the 20th century. The South Kensington Museum's roll of the complete tapestry was exhibited at the Royal Albert Hall as part of the International Exhibition of April 1873. It was widely regarded as a success. After the exhibition closed, It was put on display in the architectural courts at the museum on a rolling mechanism that the public could scroll through it themselves. It remained on display, first there and in the textiles galleries, for decades, while the copy in sections was lent out extensively to art schools and museums across the country. Many thousands of people will therefore have learnt about the tapestry from these copies made from Dossiter's negatives. Praising Dossiter's ingenious devices by which he successfully overcame the difficulties with which he had to contend, in 1875, Henry Cole's son-in-law, Frank Reed Folk, published a book on the tapestry, reproducing the images using the autotype process, a carbon printing process invented by Joseph Swan in 1864. And Dossiter's images also spread beyond the United Kingdom. Following Folk's book, Jules Comte, the head of the education department of the Ministry of Fine Art in France, also published a book using the images in 1878, but he didn't credit the photographer. These photographs, in fact, had a huge dissemination. The museum's rolled copy was included in a lone collection of French decorative art, which travelled to Glasgow in 1883. The tapestry copy was requested for loan by many institutions, including the Hastings Museum in 1899 and the Art Workers Guild in London in 1903. And the copy given to the Bayeux authorities travelled to Chicago for the World Columbian Exposition in 1893. And another full-size hand-coloured copy was purchased by Jacobsen for the Danish Museum of National History in Frederiksborg Castle, and was shown there in 1875. Two further copies were shown in the US in 1897. Interest came from scientific institutions too. In 1909, the Royal Astronomical Society requested prints as a result of increased interest in Halley's Comet, which is depicted in the tapestry, of course, and which was due to appear again in 1909. The photograph's reach was broad. For example, the prints were requested by the Art for Schools Association in 1909 and the British Instructional Films Company in 1920. So you see, they have this huge reach. Records of public inquiries to the museum demonstrate the sustained interest in the V&A's rolled copy, with people inquiring regularly over the decades whether it was still on show and whether prints or loans were available. It also spawned copies itself in different media. Lantern slides and photographically illustrated books on the tapestry were made by the museum using the 1870s negatives, further aiding their circulation. And these particular lantern slides, you can see one here, are an unusual shape as they're designed to be pulled through the lantern to, in a sense, animate each sequence, while the speaker, whose notes you can read at the top of the slide, narrates the tapestry. Both these slides and the rolled full-size photograph indicate that these photographs were not just looked at, but performed and interacted with. The lantern slides in particular could be considered time-based media in a way. In 1885, Elizabeth Wardle directed her team of English women embroiderers at the Leek Embroidery Society to trace the museum's rolled copy in order to create a full-size textile replica of the tapestry, which they duly did and which is now on display at Reading Museum. And this copy, based on Dossiter's photographs, also toured extensively. In 1886, the year it was completed, it was shown at 5 different locations in the UK and was also, again, loaned to the US. It later travelled to Germany and was shown at the Guildhall, Worcester in 1886, Brighton in 1888, Blackpool in 1889, Nottingham and Derby in 1890, and London in 1893. This again shows how Dossiter's photographs generated and influenced further copies. Until recently, the negatives from the Bayeux project were cared for by the V&A's photographic studio as part of a working back catalogue of negatives stretching from the 1850s up until the adoption of digital photography in 1997. This historic and incredible collection now forms part of the V&A archive. The painted copy of the tapestry on a roller was in 1992, after decades on display in the textiles galleries here, was placed in remote storage because of its poor condition. And an internal note at the time records that it must have been the first interactive device in the V&A and has died a noble death. Projects of this nature underline the role of photography in Britain in disseminating works of art in the 19th century, and in particular, the central role played by Henry Cole and the South Kensington Museum. The museum's photographs were considered a key source for understanding the tapestry in Britain for decades. Folke's book on the tapestry was republished in 1898, with the plates reprinted as heliogravures. And in 1914, the museum curator F.F. Birrell wrote a shilling guide to the tapestry, again using Dossiter's photographs. In the preface to the 1921 reprint of Birrell's book, the museum's director, Cecil Harcourt Smith, explained somewhat defensively, although the Bayeux Tapestry is not itself included among the collections of the museum, its surpassing interest to English students and the existence of 2 copies here amply justify the appearance of this guide. A full-size photographic reproduction coloured by hand is exhibited on the walls of the gallery. In 1943, the next director, Eric McLagan, published a book on the tapestry, in which he stated, "A complete set of photographs was made under difficult conditions in 1871 for the British government. These negatives, still preserved at the Victoria and Albert Museum, are apparently the basis of all subsequent photographic reproductions, including those in his book. It is greatly to be regretted that they have never been replaced by a new set made with modern advantages." Improvements in access and in photographic technologies meant that new photographs of the tapestry were increasingly possible from the mid-20th century, and Dossiter's negatives were gradually superseded as the main source of detailed visual information on the tapestry. In 1957, the historian Frank Stenton edited a major publication on the tapestry, which included essays by 3 current and former senior V&A staff, John Nevinson, George Wingfield Digby, and Charles Gibbs Smith. This book contained new colour images taken by the pioneering colour photographer Percy Hennell, known previously for his medical photographs of reconstructive plastic surgery performed on those injured during the Second World War. Now, this choice of photographer indicates a continued investment in obtaining the most precise and accurate images possible. Hennell's images were used in 1957 on the cover and as illustrations for a lead feature in a magazine called The Ambassador, which was an influential British trade title aimed at stimulating export markets for textiles and fashion, neatly echoing Cole's goal of improving Britain's manufacturers through access to examples of the best art and design. Hennell presented a set of his colour transparencies of the tapestry to the V&A, but these were not fully accessioned into our collections, instead being kept in filing in the textiles department. These have sadly suffered from colour shift. As you can see, they've sadly gone very pink. Among the transparencies, I discovered a typed note from Hennell, recording that his photographic lighting enabled him to notice that some of the stitched text on the tapestry was not black, as had been thought, but dark blue. And in many areas, these blue stitches had these brown stains immediately behind and next to the stitches. He proposed that this staining was different from the iron mould stains visible throughout the tapestry, and were in fact tracings of marking up for repair, and suggested that such examination through using his photographic lighting could show which areas of the tapestry were original and which were later repairs. Stenton praised Hennell's commitment to analysing the tapestry through photographic means. In 1966, Charles Gibbs Smith, who was by this time keeper of the Department of Public Relations at the V&A, wrote an article in the Times that sought to overturn the idea that the tapestry shows Harold being hit in the eye with an arrow. This caused quite a lot of controversy, and letters from members of the public in response to the article are in the V&A archive. One particularly combative message disputing Gibbs-Smith's claims prompted him to retort that he was considered one of the leading authorities on the tapestry. He immediately follows with, in his letter, "We have here in the museum every conceivable photograph in colour and black and white made from the original tapestry, which we have also, of course, studied. Some of our photographs are in fact life-size, where every smallest detail can be seen." In other words, Gibbs-Smith here is conflating his expertise with access to photographs, demonstrating the centrality of photographic surrogates of works of art in curatorial research. In 1973, Gibbs-Smith published another book on the tapestry, the fifth to be written by a V&A member of staff, including 2 directors, about an object that the V&A didn't own and had never successfully borrowed, despite requests in 1953 and 1966. In all likelihood, such scholarship was prompted not only by access to Dossiter's images and by the fame of the tapestry, but also by a desire for it to be shown in Britain. Shirley Ann Brown rightly states that facsimiles and reproductions became a way of possessing this item by proxy. The tug of war for ownership of the Bayeux Tapestry was waged through its facsimiles. Although new colour photographs were taken of the tapestry in its contemporary state, Dossiter's crisp, pin-sharp negatives gradually gained currency among scholars as a unique source of information about its state in the 1870s, before a century's worth of where conservation efforts and other changes had taken effect. The city of Bayeux, the French state, and the University of Caen are currently working on a digital project, the Spatialized Documentary Information System, or SIDS, which uses high-resolution imaging to further research into the tapestry. A recent photographic campaign to document the entire tapestry was undertaken by the French state in 2017. The SIDS database uses these images together with others obtained using different spectra and photographs of the reverse of the tapestry, are all gathered together to provide visual information for the conservators who are about to embark on a new conservation of the tapestry in advance of a refurbishment of the Bayeux Museum, due to be completed in 2027. This database will also include older visual sources in order to become the entry point for access to all documentation relevant to scientific study of the Bayeux Tapestry. Dossiter's images are also still a source of inspiration for designers and artists, as well as a conservation resource. In 2019, the fashion photographer Tim Walker was so inspired by the V&A's photographic copy that he created a photo shoot based on it. This is now touring, along with the rolled photograph, in the V&A exhibition Tim Walker, Wonderful Things, curated by Susanna Brown, and this is about to open at the Getty Museum. Edward Dossiter, the photographer whose work made so much of this possible, emigrated to New Zealand in 1876 and worked as a photographer there and in Canada before returning to the UK in about 1885 and continuing to work as a jobbing photographer. On his return, he often specialised in photographing art objects, including working for the British Museum. And I suspect that Dossiter would be amazed to discover the long history of research and engagement with the tapestry made possible by his ingenious photography of it in 1872. However, this story also reveals the use made of these photographs as tools of international diplomacy and national outreach. Despite the Bayeux Tapestry never having been loaned abroad, the V&A, through Dossiter's photographs, has played an ongoing part in supporting research into it. And as outlined in a recent agreement between the V&A and the Bayeux Museum, the V&A will digitise Dossiter's negatives and make those images available as conservation of the tapestry commences. In this way, we hope that the far-reaching impact of Dossiter's images over the past 150 years will continue. Yeah, I will finish there. Thank you so much.
Oh, Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely wonderful. And it just amazes me kind of the scale of this project. And I don't mean the scale in terms of, this tremendous photographic technical task, but also the proliferation of copies and of making these available to so many people around the world. Just everything from, this very technical aspect of having to set up a camera and make these very unwieldy negatives to making these prints, the hand painting by the students. I find it so incredible the amount of work that has gone into a copy of something that is, already so elaborate. I just find the entire thing so fascinating. Um, and aside from kind of the immensity of this task is, I just find it also so interesting that you mentioned that the role of the prints was kept in the textiles department. So, kind of the photograph completely steps aside here, and it is actually kind of stored or exhibited alongside things that that are in the photograph, but it's not being exhibited as a photograph itself. And that was what I found so interesting about your article and about the book as well, and this idea of how photographs move around the museum and kind of the different roles they have. And what your presentation clearly shows is that they had such an important role in educating people about art. So really fascinating story. Thank you. And I wanted to ask, because I see we have a couple of technical questions. So before we get onto those, I just wanted to ask, because I wasn't aware that you had actually gotten to the negatives, Dossiter's negatives. You got to those via your research into the Raphael cartoon negatives. Is that, or you were kind of looking for the oldest example of photographing a work of art? Is that how you got to them?
It was actually more freeform research, shall we say. So my colleague Erica Lederman, who researches the second museum photographer at the South Kensington Museum, Isabel Agnes Cowper, was looking for examples of negatives made by Cowper. And I was along for a ride because we work closely together and study together, and we just got so excited by the negatives we were finding, in so many different ways. I mean, the size was only one aspect actually, and we felt that this collection really deserved to be more fully explored, more fully researched. And negatives are quite hard to display, quite hard to convey. It kind of takes a while to get your eye in to be able to look at them and make sense of them. So we were just getting so excited in this remote store. I think it really came from just freeform excitement about this collection more than a more specific research question. But I think the issue of the size, like I'd been aware of Charles Thurston Thompson photographing the Raphael cartoons for some time, but seeing the negatives really brings it home to you how ambitious an operation that was.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
For me to find similar size negatives for other projects, so that the Bayeux Tapestry negatives are nearly the same, nearly as big, not quite. We also have negatives of a similar size of the Leighton frescoes at the V&A from, again, the 1870s. And I mean, I guess it's like once you have a camera that big, you want to use it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was just incredible to me to find these, and it is quite unusual to have negatives of that size. So it made me realize that the Raphael cartoons wasn't a one-off, and that the museum was really invested in this technology and using it in a lot of museum projects.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the aspects to the history of collecting at the V&A, is that there was a lot of collecting of art photographs from the beginning, or what was considered to be art photography, but mainly it was kind of for the purposes of documenting other works of art and, for example, photographs by Atget that were kind of absorbed into the National Art Library because they depicted certain staircases or certain architectural details, ironwork, I think, from a certain period. So that's interesting. And that actually leads me to my main question. Sorry, I'm not going to take up all the time, but just because you work as a curator at a museum, could you kind of maybe in a nutshell say what art photography means to you, or perhaps what role you think photography has in art? Because a lot of the images, of course, that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are not kind of considered, photographs made as works of art. So what do you think about the role of art photography versus kind of the non-collection?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's actually the topic for my PhD, so
Oh,
I have
great.
plenty to say. I'm particularly interested in, so as you probably gathered from this talk, the V&A was deeply invested in photography, collected it very expansively from about the mid-1850s. And we had this vast collection of photographs, but it was gathered as a library reference image collection rather than a collection of art photography. It was only in 1977 that the first curator of photographs was appointed, and suddenly it became a collection of the art of photography. So they had 300,000 photographs to choose from and decide which ones were art, which ones weren't.
Wow, that's a task.
Yeah. And those boundaries have shifted over time as well. We're constantly finding photographs that were categorized as reference, but we're now seeing them as art, and that those boundaries keep shifting, and that's what interests me. And also we've got brilliant documentation about where we got photographs from. We've got very detailed registers, so we can see why we were collecting photographs in the 19th century, particular photographs, where we were getting them from, and classifications that we put them into, that we wrote on the mount, give us a sense of why we might have wanted them as well. So the best example is the Julia Margaret Cameron photographs that we have, which are designated studies from life, studies from art for artists. So we weren't collecting her as example of a fine art photographer. We were saying, right, these are now reference photographs for artists who are trying to paint this kind of thing.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. I'm going to choose, so we have one very interesting technical question, which I cannot imagine what the answer might be, but I don't think you did mention this. Whether prior to the photography and printing of the Bayeux Tapestry by Dossiter, whether the nature of photographic emulsions with their limited color spectrum reproduction, whether there was any conversation about that prior to the making or printing.
Yes, I can say there isn't much discussion about that I found at all, and I would love to know. I mean, I feel like Kundal would have been able to have some pretty educated conversations about photography. He definitely knew his stuff. Another question for me is actually, they say there was a transparency made in order to enlarge from the negative to the internegative. I don't have a concept yet of what that process was exactly. And we're using similar photographs. Like the question of how we were enlarging photographs at this time has been part of the research into this whole area for me, but it's a part that I haven't solved yet.
Okay.
It's still a mystery. Like I'm trying to read through the sort of the Royal Photographic Society journal, for example, and it's not clear to me how we were doing that. And actually a lot of the photography that was happening at the museum in the 19th century was actually done by the Royal Engineers. So you had Charles Thurston Thompson as the first official photographer. Isabel Cowper takes over when he dies in 1868, but the actual printing and a few bits of photography were done by the Royal Engineers, who were based at the museum, who weirdly they were building the museum
and
they
photographing
and photographing and printing. They were also the fire wardens for the site, so they were barracked at the museum, but we were training them in photography. So they had this incredibly wide spectrum of jobs, but they seem to have been particularly interested. They were exploring photographic techniques, and I think particularly enlargement, and that's where I'd like to focus my research next. Are you still there? Can you hear me?
Hello, sorry. Yes, that must have been I'm so sorry. That must have been my internet connection.
Okay. Well, I can pick out some of I can see the Q&A as well.
Yes, please.
Whether there are plans for the V&A to show the negatives, they are quite difficult to put on display. Sadly, I would love to see a show of negatives, but they need a light source behind them.
Especially the Dossiter negatives with these where you can see the stitching so intricately. I mean, yeah, that would be amazing, but probably very, very precarious.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of light boxes. It would be a major installation, and I'm not sure we know very well about how light affects a glass plate negative in terms of how long we could put them on display with a light source behind them without damaging them. So I think there are sadly quite a lot of complexities in how we show these, though like all of the V&A collections, people can ask to see them and make an appointment, and we will show them to people.
Wonderful. So what else do we have?
Oh, somebody's asking if there are positive vintage prints from the tapestry negatives. Yes, there are. So that's the rolled colour copy, but we also have black and white prints in the guard books at the V&A. So we have a lot of vintage prints, and that coloured copy was made straight after the negatives were made. So it's.
And you said there were six. You said there were 6 copies made in total from Dossiter's negatives. Six sets.
6 sets initially.
Yeah.
But once we had the negatives, later on, I think we were printing them for all these subsequent books, and
okay.
so people could make more copies afterwards. But I think there were 6 kind of official grand copies, and we know where some of them are, but not others.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one. So in what ways did the successive photographic reproductions of the tapestry shape or contribute to the mythology surrounding the embroidery, in particular its maker's place of production and the original intended setting? Did you find out any of those while you were?
No, it's a fantastic question. I would probably suggest, so obviously the photography of the tapestry is only a tiny part of the story of the tapestry itself. And I was really reliant when I was researching this on the work of Michael Lewis and David Musgrove, Shirley Ann Brown particularly. She talks about all of the previous facsimiles that have been made of the tapestry. Carola Hicks, Gail Owen Crocker. There's a lot, as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of scholarship on the tapestry itself. And the photography is only a smaller part of it. But I think things like Charles Gibbs Smith's article, where he's coming up with different theories about what's in the tapestry, what's happening in the tapestry, and also Hennell's kind of
I was going to say the color of the thread, being able to kind of distinguish where people had maybe added things, that would probably have quite an influence.
Yeah, but also I think hopefully as we digitize the negatives and as we work more with our colleagues in Bayeux, we might be able to develop a fuller picture of this as well. I think it's a really great question.
And so then digitizing the negatives means that maybe we can go on the V&A website and zoom in kind of to
Yes.
very great detail. That's wonderful.
So they'll be on the V&A website, but also as part of the Bayeux's own documentation system, which will also be shared with the public.
Okay.
And what will be great is, like, the dream is so that the conservators there will be in front of the tapestry and be able to swipe between various different copies and reproductions and older photographs of the tapestry through time in order to inform what they're doing to the tapestry itself.
Yeah. Fantastic. Let's see, what do we have time for? We might have time for 2 more. Would you like to pick one more? Ella, you might have one where you think.
Sure. There's a question about, do we think analysing the slides could help us understand the depth of the original colours more? I think that's a great question. It's a real shame that the Henel colour transparencies have degraded, unfortunately, and we did try and digitally rescue them, but we weren't able to do
what
so.
What does that entail? Kind of trying to reverse this aging or decolorization. How does that work digitally? Because I'm aware in Photoshop you can kind of do the positive, negative, and obviously auto color, auto contrast. Is that kind of? I mean, it's probably a lot more elaborate than that, but.
Well, because Henel was a professional and was a really good photographer, he put a color scale in each image, and you could use that as a reference to say if the colors had only changed in one direction, you could use that scale and bring it back to what it once must have been digitally. But from what our photographer who had a go at it was telling me, is that the colors had shifted in multiple directions, so the scale, you couldn't do what I was hoping you might be able to do, and that's why I showed the page of the book as well. So unfortunately, the Henel images are not
salvageable,
not the resource I was hoping they would be. I think the hand painted color copy may be useful in showing as a reference for the colors, but as both that has changed over the last 150 years, and also the tapestry itself has changed since they were taken, it's not, it might be useful, but I think it's less useful than the actual stitching you can see in the negative.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe as you said, it's a matter of being able to bring as many images together, because it reminds me, I don't know where I've accessed these before, but plenty of kind of image libraries where you can switch between back to front, negative and positive, and you can kind of look at these very, very technical details. And you're right, if someone was standing in front of the tapestry, or even not, but had all these digital images at once, that would probably then make kind of a decent resource. Maybe not fully, but yeah. Let's see. Do you have access to amateur color slides of the tapestry? Is one of the questions.
I'm not it's the kind of thing we would probably have at the museum, but I'm not aware of any that we have here. Again, it's the kind of thing that would probably be in filing in somebody's office rather than in the kind of searchable collection proper.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe we should end with this very important question, whether the original tapestry will at some point actually come to the UK so people can look at it for themselves.
I can't give a definitive answer on this. I know there was a lot of press that it might come over a few years ago. I think it's since been found that the fragility of the tapestry means that that may be less possible than was initially thought. I'm not the world's authority on this, but I think it's I think one of the conditions might be that it needs to be displayed straight. So it would need a gallery that is the length of the tapestry itself in a straight line. So I think there are some major challenges just in terms of preserving it.
Yeah.
That might mean that a loan would be
And
quite
transport, I mean, you
yeah.
know, from everything to, yeah, how to kind of roll it up to climate to kind of temperature, and would probably be complex. It would be very nice though. So keep us posted.
Yeah.
Let us know. Well, thank you so much for, first of all, for your wonderful article, but also kind of for sharing it with people who might not get a copy of the magazine. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and just really points to the importance of photography as an art form or a document. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just on that note, I'd like to invite everybody to the V&A's Photography Centre, because phase 2 of our photography centre will be opening on the 25th of May. So very soon, and it's going to be incredible. So, and free. So please do come and visit.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who listened this evening. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. And thank you again to Photo London for organizing. Thank you.